Hello everyone, welcome back to the Kundalini Yogini. This is Prasiddha. Thank you so much for joining me on today's video. So today I'm going to be chatting with you guys on a topic which I have been waiting to speak about for quite some time, and like I titled the video, it's an unpopular opinion, especially I can say in the Western spiritual community. I think it's important to get a range of opinions on subjects so we can take in that information and then decide what feels right to us. And so I wanted to share with you guys today on the topic of why tradition matters and why we shouldn't just be in the mindset of thinking it has no value, thinking it's outdated, and discarding tradition, especially when it comes to spiritual traditions. We're at a time where so many different languages and cultures are being lost. And this has been happening for hundreds of years, but all in this last, few hundreds of years, so much culture has been annihilated. It started purposefully with colonization and globalization of the world, and now it's happening in much more subtle ways, but just as devastating to indigenous traditions all around the world. The cultures that are number one affected by everything that we do, even in the developed world, are indigenous people. They are the ones that face the impact of the climate crisis first. They're the ones that face all of the negative setbacks that we're causing to the environment, that we're causing to the animal and plant life around us, that we're causing by the chemicals that we're putting into the air and soil, that are being affected by the food crisis and all of these different, global issues that we've been facing for many years. And it's so sad to see people undervalue these communities and cultures, because this is the first thing I'll say. There's a reason they have existed as long as they have. There's a reason they're still living. That means that they have value. And I think it's really important to look at and acknowledge that the people that have come before us, that are our own ancestors and the ancestors of those that we might know or love or other communities around the world, they have wisdom. We should be respecting our elders. This has been a part of tradition and the way of life up until only very recently. It has shifted into kind of a disrespect for the elders and just being in this really fighting dualistic mindset that they're just always going to be suppressing the youth, which is not the case in a lot of different civilizations and different communities around the world. I think disregarding the traditions that come before us and our ancestors is really just a lot of arrogance, of thinking that we have it all figured out, that we know what we're doing better than anyone else, that we have all the solutions. I think that comes from a lot of space of ego often. And now one of the first things that you might feel, or somebody watching this might feel, is that feeling like when you stick by tradition, especially when it comes to spiritual tradition, that you're basically backing dogma or rigidity when we're talking sticking with tradition. But that is not what I mean, and I think that's a big misconception people have with tradition. They miscorrelate tradition with suppression, with old-fashioned and outdated values. And while, of course, I'm not saying that some of that's not true in certain cases, there is so much still there to value, and there's so much there to learn and teach us. And I also think that because we've been exposed to only certain cultures and traditions, especially European tradition, in our history books, I can say as a Westerner, the only civilizations you learn about all through grade school and high school is European and American history. And when we're just looking at that, yes, of course I can understand why you start getting fueled with a passion to break tradition, because a lot of the most recent tradition, I'm just talking the last hundreds of years, was a lot of violence and oppression of people that were different, whether that was ethnicity, race, religion, or gender, right? But that's not at all what the most ancient indigenous traditions have been centered on. If we look worldwide at indigenous tradition, whether it's Native American throughout North and South America, whether it's indigenous African, whether it's tribal Indian culture or ancient Chinese civilizations, all of these really, really old civilizations and societies had similar values of deep respect for life, not just human beings, but plant and animal life around them, a very deep reverence for nature and respecting the planet as a god or goddess, as that supreme force that is meant to be really revered and respected, and that we are only a little part of this equation, instead of feeling like this ego, that human beings are the dominators of this planet that we see more in the modern times. And a lot of these indigenous traditions have very forward-thinking values, actually. Many of them acknowledge multiple genders, not just two, not just male and female. Many of them talk about direct connection to God or source and ways we can commune with that source. So I really think that we need to shift this cognition that traditions are only there to suppress us or violate us, and understand that many indigenous and ancient traditions are there to really aid in our growth and our spiritual evolution. Now, to refine this just a little bit further in terms of spirituality that I was mentioning I would talk about at the beginning of the video, I think that it's really important to also clear up these misbeliefs we might hold about spiritual tradition. I think that in the name of approachability, making spirituality accessible or easily accessible for all people, the problem has occurred that in that process, and I'm not saying that that's always a bad thing, of course, no, but in that process of making spirituality user-friendly, so to speak, we have lost a lot. A lot has been diluted, and why I want to bring this to your attention is that spiritual traditions are being misrepresented, mistaught, and often taught out of arrogance or out of ignorance. And the reason I bring this up is not to just, point out a flaw. What I want to share with you is because I care about you guys, and I care about myself, and I care about all people. And what happens is when we take spiritual sciences, which are energy sciences at the end of the day, and we don't know them or comprehend them fully, we don't know the ins and outs of them, we're not learning them from someone who is really knowledgeable in the tradition, what happens is we can often actually hurt ourselves and others. We can actually have the opposite effect of what we're wanting to gain from spiritual practices, and I'll give you a few examples of this in a few minutes. Now, in regards to spiritual tradition, I'll share with you guys the example of Sanatana Dharma, or commonly known and understood as Hinduism. The reason why I am so in love and really can authentically share with you that I believe in standing by the traditions of Sanatana Dharma is because it's a living tradition. Now, when we have a religion or a culture that has died with a certain person, a certain civilization, what happens is hundreds of years after, or decades after even, it starts to get changed, right? It starts to get misinterpreted by human beings, and it's like that game Telephone, right? When you play as a kid. If one person starts with a sentence at the beginning of a chain of people, by the end it's a totally different sentence. And you can see that with traditions like based on the Bible, because there hasn't been living masters since Jesus that have been accepted as part of that tradition. Now, why Sanatana Dharma, I can say, is such a different type of tradition is because although I'm talking about the importance of following tradition and looking at ancient scriptures and seeing what this kind of lineage of masters and ancestors has done before us and respecting that and following it, the reason why it has been so successful, specifically within Sanatana Dharma, is because it's a tradition based on living masters, which means that what we believe in Sanatana Dharma is you cannot just take a scripture and have that be a living tradition. That will always end up in problems because our human consciousness will misinterpret and dilute and create confusion. But when we have a living master, enlightened beings, sages, avatars that we believe are constantly a part of the tradition, accepted in the tradition, and guiding us as a guru to disciple, that it's a very alive, living tradition. The reason why it's so important to have these beings around us is because when a being is enlightened in that pure space of consciousness, they have gone beyond the ego. So they cannot, it's impossible for them to dilute or misinterpret things. And so when we have a living master around us to teach us spiritual sciences, what they can do is show us this tradition and lineage, tell us the stories, tell us the methodologies, but make it, number one, applicable to us now in the modern times, and two, make sure it's interpreted actually as it was supposed to be. And this becomes a huge issue, right? Because if we don't have a being like this, we're translating Sanskrit to French to English, and then my human consciousness is interpreting that in the best way I know how. So much can go wrong in that process, and that's why having living masters, gurus around us is a part of Sanatana Dharma, and why it's one of the most successful lineages to keep its original form. And it's not just the only one, but it's one example I'm sharing with you guys. The last thing I'll touch on, and I hope you guys have made it this far because this is definitely the thing I want you to take away from this video, is that spirituality and spiritual tradition is a powerful energy science, which means that when we misinterpret or change that science and that equation, or we accidentally leave something out of ignorance, what can happen is a totally different result. And I think it's not to put fear into us. I'm not telling you this to put fear into you at all. I'm telling you this because we need to be educated about how powerful these sciences really are. For example, mantra and yoga. These are both very popular energy spiritual sciences which have become really well known in the West. Now, both of these sciences are extremely complex, extremely detailed. And when I say that, I don't mean it lightly. I mean there's thousands of books, scriptures, references, verses on these sciences and how to do them properly and how to do them to get the right benefit, the benefit that you're looking for. But what the scriptures and masters also say is when mantra is done incorrectly, when you don't pronounce it right, when you maybe have not been initiated to that mantra yet, mantra can actually have negative effects on you. So the same mantra you might want to be chanting for prosperity or spiritual growth could actually be harming you because you haven't learned the mantra science from a guru, or you haven't learned it properly or been initiated into it. Same way, the science of yoga. Yoga is taught and shown right now, right, as something which everybody should be able to do in any way whatsoever, just start. The problem with this is that yoga is also a very strong energy science. And people don't know that they could be hurting what they don't know. And that means they can be hurting themselves. They can be hurting others by teaching them wrong information. An example of this is doing inversion. So when you do a posture or an asana that is inverted, which means your head is down, your legs are up, like a headstand. Those are contraindicated, which means it says many times in the yogic texts, in the yogic scriptures, that if you drink alcohol and you do an inversion, you do a headstand, you will have mental disorders. It will bring mental disorders and imbalance your doshas very, very strongly. Nobody knows this. Nobody's sharing this information because they're scared to upset people. And so the science gets diluted. Somebody who's drinking alcohol, thousands of people who are drinking alcohol are doing inversions, and they could be actually subjected to anxiety and depression and have no idea why it's happening. And because they didn't have the full picture painted for them. Our ignorance is causing us to hurt ourselves in the journey, and that's really all I want to leave you guys with is please just keep a really open mind and a humble consciousness to be willing to learn from those that have come before us, to be willing and open-hearted to living traditions that have been around, and they're there to teach us, they're there to guide us. Our ancestors, our masters, our spiritual lineage is there to help us have the best results in our spiritual journey, our conscious growth along the way without hurting ourselves in that time, without hurting others in that time. And so tradition really matters, and I will stand by this forever because I've experienced it and I know it to be true. And I just hope that more and more people can be open to listening to this and be open to respecting culture and tradition instead of just writing it off, in the name of being politically correct. I think there's a lot that we need to value in tradition, indigenous tradition around the world, especially when it comes to spirituality. So I hope that this video brought you something to think about. Even if you don't agree with me, that's absolutely okay, but I just wanted to share this different perspective with you. I would love to hear your thoughts, your contributions to this, conversation in the comments down below. Let me know what you all think about it. So thank you for joining me on this video. Make sure to follow me on all other social media platforms at Kundalini Yogini and Kundalini Yogini Prasiddha on Instagram and Facebook for more updates and content. So I love you guys. Have a beautiful week, and I will see you on the next video. Nityanandam, everyone.